What happens when a devoted wife is publicly humiliated by her husband's mistress? Do you think she crumbles in defeat? Think again. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a tale of calculated revenge and glorious transformation. You're about to witness how a woman mocked for her simple clothes orchestrates a takedown so epic, so perfectly executed that it brings a millionaire to his knees. She doesn't just get even, she redefines the entire game. Stay tuned, because the moment a seemingly meek wife arrives in haute couture and the cameras start flashing, everything changes. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York glittered with the kind of incandescent light that only old money and new ambition could generate. It was the annual Heart of the City Gala, a cornerstone event for Manhattan's philanthropic elite. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto tables laden with floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, self-satisfied hum of the city's most powerful players. Catherine Ashworth moved through it all with the quiet grace she'd honed over 15 years of marriage to Richard Ashworth. At 42, she was still a classically beautiful woman, with serene blue eyes and honey blonde hair pinned into a simple, elegant chignon. Tonight she wore a deep sapphire blue silk dress by Carolina Herrera. It was understated tasteful and at least 3 seasons old. In a sea of sequins feathers and daring décolletage, Catherine was a portrait of timeless, almost forgettable elegance. She knew this, and on most nights she was comfortable with it. Tonight, however, felt different. Her husband Richard was a shark in a Savile Row suit. He wasn't just in the room, he owned it. His real estate empire, Ashworth Holdings, had its steel and glass tentacles wrapped around half the city's skyline. He was charismatic, with a booming laugh that commanded attention and a smile that could disarm his fiercest competitors. But for the past year, that smile had rarely been directed at Catherine. She saw him across the room holding court near the silent auction displays. And next to him, practically fused to his side, was Zara. Zara Flynn was everything Catherine was not. She was 26, with a mane of fiery red hair that cascaded over her shoulders and a body poured into a shimmering gold-sequined dress that left little to the imagination. She was a social media influencer, a reality TV starlet, a woman whose entire career was built on being seen. Her laughter was loud and throaty, a stark contrast to the polite titters of the other women. She was Richard's mistress, a fact that was perhaps the worst-kept secret in their social circle. Catherine's hand tightened on her small clutch. She had agreed to come tonight for the sake of appearances, a phrase that had become the unofficial motto of their marriage. Richard had insisted. "It's for the children's hospital, Ev. We have to show a united front," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished marble, while his eyes were already distant, likely on his phone texting Zara. She took a fortifying sip of her champagne and began the slow, familiar waltz of a society wife moving from one conversation circle to another, exchanging pleasantries with people she'd known for years. "Catherine, you look lovely," said Margaret Vanderbilt, her own gown a riot of Oscar de la Renta ruffles. "As do you, Margaret," Catherine replied with a genuine smile. She actually liked Margaret, but her gaze kept being pulled back to Richard and Zara. They were now standing with a group that included some of Richard's most important investors, including the formidable Japanese tycoon, Mr. Tanaka. Richard was gesturing expansively, telling a story, and Zara was clinging to his arm, looking up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. It was a performance, and a sickeningly good one. Catherine felt a familiar pang, a dull, aching mix of humiliation and sorrow. It wasn't the affair itself that wounded her most deeply anymore. The initial shock had long since curdled into a kind of chronic pain. It was the brazenness of it. Richard didn't just have a mistress, he flaunted her. He was daring Catherine to challenge him to make a scene, knowing she was too private, too dignified to do so. As if sensing her attention, Zara's eyes, sharp and green as a cat's, flicked across the room and met Catherine's. A slow, smug smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She whispered something in Richard's ear. He glanced over at Catherine, his expression momentarily unreadable, before turning back to his audience. Later, as Catherine was speaking with the gala's chairwoman, she overheard Zara's voice, sharp and carrying from a nearby group. "Can you believe it? It's like she just stepped out of a 2010 catalogue," Zara said, her voice dripping with condescension. A few sycophantic giggles followed. "I mean, I get that she's of a certain generation, but this is the heart of the city gala. Not a suburban book club meeting. Richard has such an image to maintain. It's a shame his wife doesn't seem to care." The words struck Catherine with physical force. It wasn't just an insult. It was a public stripping of her value, a declaration that she was no longer fit for the world she had helped Richard build. The woman who had hosted countless dinners for his clients, who had remembered the names of their children and their favorite wines, who had stood by him through financial crises and corporate battles, was now being dismissed as a dowdy relic by the woman sleeping in her husband's bed. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to turn to walk over there and slap the smug look off Zara's face. She wanted to scream at Richard for allowing this, for creating the environment where such disrespect could flourish. But she didn't. Instead, she excused herself with a calm murmur and walked towards the terrace, her posture ramrod straight. The cool night air was a relief. Below Central Park was a dark, sprawling mystery, its edges fringed with the lights of the city. She gripped the cold stone balustrade, her knuckles white. She had been a fool. Her dignity, her quiet suffering, her belief in maintaining a united front, what had it gotten her? It had been interpreted not as strength, but as weakness, as permission. Richard found her there 10 minutes later. "There you are," he said, his tone breezy, as if he hadn't just stood by while his mistress mocked her. "Tanaka is about to leave. I want us to say goodbye, together." Catherine turned to face him, her eyes cold. "I heard what she said, Richard." He had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable. He loosened his tie. "Zara can be a little much. She's young. She doesn't understand the nuances of our world." "The nuances?" Catherine's voice was dangerously low. "The nuance where you allow your mistress to publicly humiliate your wife while you're trying to close a deal. Is that in the manual?" "Oh, for God's sake, Catherine, don't be so dramatic." He snapped, his patience always thin with her lately evaporating. "It was a silly comment about a dress. A dress, is that what this is about? If you want a new dress, go buy one. Buy 10. Buy the whole damn store. You know I don't care about the money." That was it. That was the core of his dismissal. He thought this was about a dress. He thought her pain, her humiliation, her entire identity could be placated with a shopping trip. He was no longer seeing her as a partner, or even as a person. She was just another one of his assets, one that had apparently depreciated over time. "You're right," she said, her voice suddenly calm clear and utterly devoid of the emotion he expected. "It is a silly comment about a dress." Richard looked at her, surprised by her sudden capitulation. He expected tears, recriminations, another draining argument, that would go nowhere. Her placid agreement unnerved him. "Good," he said cautiously. "So let's go see Tanaka off." As she walked back into the glittering ballroom at his side, presenting the perfect picture of the supportive wife, something inside Catherine shifted. The pain didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened into a suspect, single sharp point of purpose. Richard was right. It wasn't about the dress. It was about everything the dress represented, and he in his arrogance had just handed her the very weapon she needed. He thought she was a relic from a bygone era. He and his flashy, loud, modern mistress thought her style of quiet strength was obsolete. They were about to find out how wrong they were. As she smiled graciously at Mr. Tanaka, she made a silent vow. She would not leave Richard. Not yet. That would be too easy, too predictable. No, she would not be the tragic wife who faded into obscurity. She would become the woman Richard couldn't afford to lose, and the woman Zara could never hope to be. The game had been set, and Catherine Ashworth, a woman of a certain generation, was about to rewrite the rules. The days following the gala were a study in deceptive tranquility. On the surface, nothing in the Ashworths' cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment changed. Richard was busy consumed by the final negotiations of the Tanaka deal. He came home late, smelling faintly of Zara's heady perfume, and left early, his mind already on spreadsheets and zoning laws. He and Catherine moved around each other with the practiced, distant choreography of a long-married couple who had run out of things to say. He mistook her silence for acquiescence, her calm for defeat. It was a fatal miscalculation. For Catherine, the apartment had transformed from a home into a headquarters. The humiliation at the gala had not broken her. It had forged her. The dull ache of betrayal had been replaced by the cold, clear fire of resolve. She was no longer a victim in her own life story. She was the architect of its next chapter. Her first move was not to a divorce lawyer, but to her laptop. She didn't research asset division or custody arrangements. Instead, she spent hours in her late father's old study, a room Richard never entered, surrounded by his leather-bound books on finance and art history. Her father, a respected investment banker, had taught her more than just how to appreciate a Monet. He had taught her how to read a balance sheet, and more importantly, how to understand that true power rarely shouts. Catherine began by meticulously untangling her own finances from Richard's labyrinthine empire. Over the years, she had paid little attention, allowing him and his army of accountants to manage everything. Now she scrutinized every statement, every trust, every investment vehicle that bore her name. She discovered that thanks to a prescient prenuptial agreement her father had insisted upon, and several inheritances she had received, she was independently wealthier than Richard probably remembered. She was not just a dependent, she was a silent partner. Her second step was a phone call, not to a friend for a tearful lunch, but to a number she hadn't dialed in over a decade. "Antoine," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "It's Catherine. Catherine Ashworth." On the other end of the line, in a chic Parisian atelier, Antoine Dubois, one of the world's most revered and reclusive couturiers, paused in his sketching. He remembered Catherine, not as the wife of a brash American tycoon, but as the daughter of his old friend, a young woman with an innate, quiet understanding of style that was a rarity. "Catherine," he said, his voice warm with surprise. "Ma chérie, it has been too long. What can I do for you?" "I need a dress, Antoine," she said simply. "No, I need more than a dress. I need a suit of armor." Intrigued, Antoine listened as Catherine explained not the sordid details of her husband's affair, but the essence of her objective. She didn't speak of revenge or humiliation. She spoke of reclamation, of presence, of making a statement without uttering a single word. She wasn't a woman scorned. She was a patron with a vision. It was a language Antoine understood perfectly. "I am not interested in what is in season," Catherine concluded. "I am interested in what is eternal." "Leave it with me," Antoine said. A creative spark ignited. "I have an idea. Something transformative." He told her he would fly to New York for a private consultation the following week. The final piece of her initial strategy was the most crucial. Catherine knew that a new dress, no matter how spectacular, would just be a fleeting spectacle without the right narrative. She needed to control the story. For this, she turned to the best. She secured a meeting with Serena Vance, the head of Vance Communications, a PR firm so exclusive and so effective that they were known in media circles as the Queen Makers. Serena was a legend, sharp, impeccably dressed, and notoriously selective about her clientele. She didn't handle scandals. She built legacies. They met in a discreet tea lounge at the Carlisle Hotel. Serena, with her severe black bob and piercing gaze, listened intently as Catherine laid out her situation. Again, Catherine was strategic. She painted a picture not of a marriage in crisis, but of a woman at a crossroads. "For 15 years I have been Mrs. Richard Ashworth," Catherine explained, her hands resting calmly on her lap. "I have supported his ambitions, raised our children, and managed our social obligations. I have been a partner in building the Ashworth name. Now I feel it's time to cultivate my own identity, to step into the light on my own terms." She mentioned her desire to revive her family's dormant charitable foundation, focusing on arts education for underprivileged children, a cause she was genuinely passionate about. She was leveraging her own history, her own name, the one she had before Ashworth. Serena watched her, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Most women who came to her were in a panic, desperate to salvage a reputation. Catherine was calm, composed, and thinking 3 moves ahead. She wasn't asking Serena to clean up a mess. She was inviting her to build a monument. "And Richard," Serena asked, her voice neutral, "what is his role in this evolution?" "Richard is as always focused on his business," Catherine said with a small, enigmatic smile. "He believes my world is very small. He has no idea of the scale of my plans. He thinks my greatest ambition is redecorating the summer house in the Hamptons." Serena's lips curved into a rare, knowing smile. "Men like your husband often suffer from a failure of imagination when it comes to their wives," she observed. "They see the woman they married 20 years ago, not the woman she has become. So you want to launch your foundation, and you want to do it in a way that is impossible to ignore." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "The annual Modern Masters Gala at the Met is in 6 weeks." Serena said, her mind already working. "It is the most photographed event of the spring season. More press than the Heart of the City Gala by a factor of 10. Everyone who is anyone in art, finance, and media will be there. That will be our stage." A plan began to form between them, a carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers and strategic leaks. They would seed stories in the right columns, not about the affair, but about Catherine Ashworth's re-emergence. Stories about the revival of her family's philanthropic legacy, about her passion for art, about her quiet influence. They would build her up piece by piece, creating a narrative so compelling that by the time she walked onto that red carpet, she wouldn't just be Richard Ashworth's wife. She would be a power in her own right. When Catherine returned to the apartment that afternoon, Richard was home early for once. He was on the phone, pacing in the living room. "No, Zara, you can't come," he was saying, his voice a low, frustrated growl. "The Met Gala is a different beast. It's A-list only. Corporate tables. My table is for investors. No, it's not about you. It's about business." Catherine walked past him, a ghost in her own home. He barely glanced at her. He was too busy managing the expectations of his mistress, completely oblivious to the quiet revolution being plotted just a few feet away. He was fighting the wrong battle, watching the wrong front. He was so focused on the noisy, glittering distraction of Zara that he failed to notice the silent tectonic shift happening right under his feet. The wife he took for granted was quietly sharpening her weapons, assembling her allies, and preparing to step onto a stage he couldn't control. The 6 weeks leading up to the Met Gala were a masterclass in subtlety. While Richard was consumed by the final frantic stages of his deal with Tanaka, a deal Catherine knew that was becoming more complicated than he let on, she was quietly building her coalition. This was not a war to be won with shouting matches in their marble-floored foyer, but with discreet lunches, rekindled friendships, and the slow, steady drip of information into the right channels. Her first and most important alliance was with a woman named Beatrice Dubois, the widow of a French diplomat and a revered figure in the art world. Beatrice was Antoine the couturier's cousin, a woman who moved with the quiet authority of someone who had seen empires rise and fall over cocktails. She had been a dear friend of Catherine's mother, and Catherine had always admired her wisdom and her encyclopedic knowledge of New York society. They met at La Grenouille, a bastion of old-world charm that felt a world away from the trendy transient spots Zara frequented. Over glasses of Sancerre, Catherine laid out the full story, holding nothing back. She spoke of Richard's affair, Zara's public mockery, and her husband's profound underestimation of her. Beatrice listened, her elegantly wrinkled face betraying nothing but thoughtful concentration. When Catherine finished, she reached across the table and patted her hand. "My dear," she said, her voice a low, cultured murmur. "Men like Richard Ashworth build their worlds on the foundations their wives provide. They become so accustomed to the stability, they forget the foundation is there, until it cracks." She took a sip of her wine. "So you are not merely redecorating the house. You are rebuilding it on your own terms. I approve." Beatrice's approval was more than a comfort. It was a key. She opened doors that had been closed to Catherine for years. Doors Catherine hadn't even realized she wanted to walk through. Suddenly, Catherine was co-hosting a private viewing at a Chelsea gallery, with Beatrice being reintroduced to museum curators, artists, and most importantly the city's old money philanthropists, the very people whose respect Richard craved but could never fully command. They saw in Catherine not Richard's appendage, but the daughter of a man they had respected, and a woman of substance in her own right. They spoke of her revived foundation, the Langley Foundation for the Arts, with genuine interest. Her passion was authentic, her knowledge of art history deep. She wasn't a bored wife looking for a hobby. She was a serious person with a serious mission. Meanwhile, Serena Vance and her team were working their magic in the press. There were no salacious leaks about the affair. That would have been too crude, too Zara-like. Instead, a different narrative began to take shape. A small item appeared in the New York Times style section about the resurgence of quiet luxury and intellectual philanthropy, subtly contrasting it with the louder, more performative charity of the new money crowd. Catherine's name was mentioned as a prime example of the former. A piece in Town and Country Online profiled the legacy givers, children of prominent families, who were reviving their parents' charitable work. The Langley Foundation was featured prominently with a quote from Catherine about her father's belief that art is the conscience of a city. There was no picture of her, just her words, which gave them more weight. These whispers were a form of psychological warfare. They didn't attack Richard or Zara directly. They simply created a world, a standard of elegance and purpose, from which Zara, by her very nature, was excluded. Zara, who documented her every expensive meal and sponsored vacation on Instagram, was the embodiment of the performative culture the article subtly decried. Richard, when he noticed it all, was pleased. "Good press for the family," he commented one morning, glancing at a mention of the Langley Foundation in a society column. "Glad you're keeping busy, Ev." He was so blinded by his own ego that he saw her activities as a charming, harmless extension of his own brand building, like a new, tastefully decorated wing of his corporate headquarters. He failed to see it was a separate building entirely with its own foundation and its own source of power. Zara, however, was not so complacent. She saw the shift, and it infuriated her. Her world was built on attention, and suddenly a sliver of that attention was being diverted to the boring wife. "What is this stuff I keep seeing about Catherine's foundation?" she demanded of Richard one night in her sleek, minimalist Tribeca loft, a loft paid for by an LLC connected to Ashworth Holdings. "She's making it sound like she's the next Brooke Astor. It's embarrassing. People are going to think you can't control your own wife." "It's nothing, baby," Richard soothed, distracted by a dozen other business pressures. "It's a little project to keep her happy. It means nothing, but it did mean something." Zara's insecurity began to make her sloppy. She became louder, more demanding. She posted increasingly lavish photos online, a new diamond bracelet, a weekend trip to St. Bart's on a private jet, in a desperate attempt to reassert her status as the woman at the center of Richard's world. But in the new context Serena Vance had created, her post started to look less glamorous and more grasping. The comments section, once a stream of fawning praise, began to see a few dissenting voices. "This is so tacky. Some people have more money than class." Catherine's final and perhaps most critical alliance was forged in the world Richard respected most: finance. She had lunch with Michael Chen, a rival developer and a man Richard had bested in a particularly nasty bidding war 5 years prior. They had never been friends, but they shared a mutual acquaintance in Beatrice Dubois, who arranged the meeting. Catherine didn't ask Michael for money or business advice. She simply guided the conversation to the Tanaka deal. She mentioned offhandedly that Richard seemed under a lot of pressure, that the financing seemed more complex than usual. Michael, a shrewd and observant man, picked up on the cue. "Richard is a gambler," he said, stirring his espresso. "He over-leveraged to get the financing for that project. He's counting on Tanaka not only to invest, but to bring in their banking partners. If that deal falls through, he'll be dangerously exposed." Catherine simply nodded, filing the information away. She didn't need to do anything with it. She just needed to know it. Knowledge she was rediscovering was the ultimate form of power. On the eve of the Met Gala, Antoine arrived from Paris with a team and several large, heavily insured garment bags. He set up in one of the guest suites of the Ashworth apartment, which he turned into a private fitting room. When Catherine saw the dress for the first time, she gasped. It wasn't a dress. It was a masterpiece. It was not loud or flashy. It didn't scream for attention. It commanded it. It was a column of celestial midnight blue silk, so dark it was almost black, that seemed to absorb the light around it. But the artistry was in the details. Thousands of tiny hand-sewn platinum beads formed a breathtaking, abstract constellation that cascaded down one shoulder and across the bodice, pooling at her hip, before scattering down the length of the gown. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly unique. It was a suit of armor forged from silk and starlight. "It is you, chérie," Antoine said softly. Strong, serene, with a universe of fire inside. As she stood before the mirror, she saw not the woman who had cried on the terrace of the Pierre Hotel. She saw her father's daughter. She saw a patron of the arts. She saw the head of the Langley Foundation. She saw a woman who had quietly gathered her forces, built her alliances, and was now finally ready for the main event. Richard was still trying to figure out how to tell Zara she couldn't come to the party. He had no idea his wife was about to become the party. The air outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art crackled with an electric, chaotic energy. It was a symphony of shouting paparazzi, the basso thrum of black SUVs, and the high-pitched squeals of fans pressed against police barricades. The theme of this year's Met Gala was Celestial Bodies, and the red carpet, a vast, sweeping staircase, was already a galaxy of fashion's brightest, boldest stars. It was a spectacle of epic proportions, and into this maelstrom, Richard Ashworth arrived looking smug and triumphant. The Tanaka deal, after weeks of tense, exhausting negotiations, had finally been signed that morning. To Richard, this gala was not just a social obligation. It was a victory lap. He had his investors at his table, a multi-billion-dollar project secured, and he had successfully managed to handle Zara, who was currently pouting on a consolation prize trip to Monaco paid for by him. He stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo, ready to soak in the adulation he felt was his due. His wife Catherine was arriving separately. He'd barely seen her all day, assuming she was engaged in some last-minute fussing over her hair and makeup. He did his obligatory turn on the red carpet, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with a city councilman, and basking in the glow of his success. He was holding court midway up the stairs, accepting congratulations from a rival developer when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. It began as a murmur at the base of the staircase, a ripple of excitement that quickly turned into a roar. The chaotic barrage of flashes from the photographers, which had been diffused across a dozen different celebrities, suddenly coalesced, focusing with laser-like intensity on a single point. Every camera, every lens, every eye turned towards a new arrival. Richard squinted, annoyed at having his spotlight stolen. He saw a car pull up a discreet black Maybach, and from it emerged a woman. For a moment his brain failed to process what he was seeing. It was Catherine. But it was not the Catherine he knew. The woman on the red carpet was not the quiet, tastefully dressed wife he took for granted. This was a celestial event in human form. The Antoine Dubois gown was more than a dress. It was a statement of power. The midnight silk drank the harsh light of the flashbulbs and reflected it back as a soft, ethereal glow. The platinum beadwork glittered like a newly discovered nebula, catching the light with every graceful movement. Her hair, usually in a simple chignon, was swept up in an intricate regal style that highlighted the elegant column of her neck. On her ears were not her usual pearl studs, but a pair of stunning diamond drop earrings that looked like captured starlight. She didn't hurry up the stairs. She moved with a serene, unassailable confidence, pausing as the photographers screamed her name. "Catherine! To your left, Catherine!" Look here, they weren't shouting, "Mrs. Ashworth." They were shouting her name. Richard stood, frozen, a half-empty champagne flute in his hand. His investors, Mr. Tanaka included, fell silent beside him. Their eyes were all fixed on Catherine. He could feel their surprise, their admiration, their reassessment. But the dress was only the opening salvo. As Catherine reached the top of the stairs, she was met not just by the customary greeters, but by Serena Vance, who seamlessly guided her towards a waiting group of reporters from Vogue, the New York Times, and the Associated Press, the media heavyweights. This was no coincidence. This was an ambush. "Catherine, you look absolutely breathtaking," said a well-known fashion journalist. "Antoine Dubois, of course. He hasn't dressed an American in years. How did you convince him?" Catherine smiled a calm, radiant smile that was broadcast on screens around the world. "Antoine is an old family friend," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He understood the spirit of what I wanted to achieve tonight. This isn't just about fashion. It's about art, and the power of art to transform." Richard watched a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This was not his quiet, unassuming Catherine. This was a stranger, a polished, articulate, formidable stranger. Then came the master stroke. A reporter from the Times stepped forward. "Catherine, there have been whispers for weeks. Can you confirm the rumors about the Langley Foundation?" This was the moment. This was the culmination of 6 weeks of planning of quiet alliances and strategic whispers. "I can," Catherine said, her gaze sweeping over the cameras, seemingly oblivious to her husband, standing just 20 feet away. "I am thrilled to formally announce tonight that after years of dormancy, I am relaunching my family's foundation. The Langley Foundation for the Arts is dedicated to funding arts education in New York City's most underserved communities." She continued hitting the key messages Serena Vance had drilled into her. "In a world focused on building higher and faster, we often forget to nurture the soul of our city. The Langley Foundation will ensure that the next generation of artists, dreamers, and innovators has the opportunity to flourish." Then came the twist that landed like a body blow to Richard. "And I'm not doing it alone," Catherine announced. She gestured to the side and stepping forward. To join her were Beatrice Dubois, Michael Chen, and most shockingly, Mrs. Tanaka, a woman known for her own significant philanthropic work in Japan. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Michael Chen, his sworn rival, and Mrs. Tanaka. Her presence was an implicit and very public endorsement. He saw the look on Mr. Tanaka's face, a mixture of surprise and deep respect directed entirely at Catherine. In that moment, Richard ceased to be the sole power player in his own deal. His wife had just flanked him, aligning herself with his rival and the family of his most important new partner. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously. The story was no longer just Richard Ashworth closes Tanaka deal. It was now Catherine Ashworth launches major philanthropic foundation with a powerhouse board upstaging her own husband at the Met Gala. Someone finally thrust a microphone in Richard's face. "Richard, what a surprise. Your wife's new foundation is the talk of the gala. What are your thoughts on this incredible announcement?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely blindsided. This wasn't a little project. This was a coup executed with military precision on the most public stage imaginable. He looked at Catherine, who finally met his gaze from across the sea of reporters. There was no anger in her eyes, no vindictive triumph. There was only a cool, calm strength he had never seen before. It was the look of a woman who had finally realized her own worth, a woman who no longer needed his permission or his approval. He felt a wave of dizziness. He saw the smirks on the faces of his competitors. He saw the calculating look in Mr. Tanaka's eyes. He had spent the day celebrating a business victory, believing he was the king of his universe. But as the cameras flashed and the world watched, he realized the devastating truth. His wife, the woman he had dismissed and allowed his mistress to mock, had just built her own kingdom. And she had built it right in the center of his drawing, a new map of power, one where he was no longer the undisputed ruler. The foundation of his world had not just cracked, it had shattered. The fallout from the Met Gala was not a loud explosion, but a series of quiet, devastating shockwaves that dismantled Richard Ashworth's world from the inside out. It began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the East River. Richard, awake after a restless night, saw the first alerts ping on his phone. The online editions of the city's major publications were live, and their verdict was unanimous. His hard-won Tanaka deal, the supposed crowning achievement of his year, was relegated to a dense, jargon-filled column on the business page. But the front pages of the style and society sections, the digital and print real estate that shaped the opinions of the world he lived in, were a different story. They were a shrine to Catherine. Vogue ran a multi-photo spread under the headline, "Catherine Ashworth's Celestial Coup, More Than a Dress, a Declaration." The article deconstructed her look not just as a fashion choice, but as a political statement. In a sea of borrowed glamour and fleeting trends, the journalist wrote, "Catherine Ashworth in bespoke Antoine Dubois reminded us of the enduring power of personal history and quiet purpose. She didn't just wear a dress, she inhabited an idea." The New York Times was even more impactful. The rebirth of a philanthropist, Langley Foundation takes center stage as Catherine Ashworth steps from the shadows. The piece lauded her initiative, framing it as a necessary antidote to the transactional charity of the new money elite. It detailed the impressive board she had assembled, the respected art world doyenne Beatrice Dubois, the rival magnate Michael Chen, and the internationally esteemed Mrs. Tanaka. The narrative Serena Vance had so carefully constructed had become gospel overnight. Catherine was no longer an accessory. She was the main event. In her sun-drenched Monaco hotel suite, Zara Flynn woke up to a reality that felt like a personal attack. Her phone was buzzing incessantly, but not with the fawning praise she was used to. It was a deluge of tags, mentions, and DMs, all pointing her to the same galling story, Catherine's triumph. A venomous rage, hot and acidic, filled her. She had been exiled, sent away with a diamond bracelet as a pacifier, so that this relic could have her moment. Scrambling, she went on the offensive. She frantically posted a series of Instagram stories, a pouting selfie on the deck of a yacht, the crystal-clear water, a backdrop to her manufactured ennui, a close-up of a newly purchased Hermès handbag placed artfully on a cafe table, a boomerang video of clinking champagne glasses with a faceless male friend she'd hired for the day. Her captions were a desperate volley for relevance. "Living my best life, #unbothered. Some girls get titles, others get treasures. Monaco life." But her timing could not have been worse. For the first time, the world was in fact unbothered by Zara Flynn. Her desperate displays of wealth, which just weeks ago might have been seen as aspirational, now looked childish and crass against the backdrop of Catherine's grand, meaningful gesture. The comments section, once her personal echo chamber of adoration, became a firing squad. "While you're posting selfies, his wife is actually changing the world. This is so tacky. Read the room. Class versus trash, and we all know which one you are." That hashed unbothered tag seems very bothered. The final nail in the coffin of her public persona came not from a troll, but from her agent. The call came in the afternoon. "Zara," he said, his voice tight and devoid of its usual sycophancy. "That luxury watch campaign we were closing, they're pulling the offer." "What? Why?" She shrieked, the champagne glass trembling in her hand. "Their brand is about timeless elegance, Zara. They feel your current public perception is not aligned with that message. They're going in a different direction." The line went dead, leaving Zara in a silent, gilded cage of her own making. Her brand, built on being the glittering center of attention, had been instantly and irrevocably devalued. She was no longer the scandalous, exciting other woman. She was just the tacky mistress of a man whose wife had just become a legend. For Richard, the consequences were more immediate and far more severe. He walked into a follow-up lunch with Mr. Tanaka and his team, expecting to finalize logistics. Instead, he found Catherine already seated at the table, deep in conversation with Mrs. Tanaka. Mr. Tanaka had specifically requested her presence. The atmosphere was palpably different. The talk was not of concrete and steel, but of art and legacy. Mr. Tanaka turned to Catherine. "My wife was telling me about your foundation's focus on preserving traditional art forms among the youth. It is a subject dear to my heart." Catherine responded with an erudite point about the loss of artisanal skills in the digital age, her knowledge fluent and her passion genuine. Richard could only sit there, a silent, useless observer, at his own meeting. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he watched the scene unfold. He had always presented himself as the lone wolf, the singular genius behind his empire. Now Tanaka and his other investors saw that his greatest asset was the one he had neglected and disrespected. They saw Catherine not as a potential liability in a messy divorce, but as a stabilizing force, a woman of integrity. His own character, by extension, was now under review. His reckless affair was no longer a private matter. It was a glaring business risk. "Your wife is a formidable woman, Ashworth's son," Tanaka said to Richard later, as they were leaving his words a perfectly courteous dagger. "A company's strength is not just in its balance sheet, but in the character of its leadership. All of its leadership." The social shunning was swift and brutal. It wasn't a formal decree, but 1,000 tiny cuts. He called his regular golf partner a man he'd known for 20 years, only to be met with a flimsy, unbelievable excuse about a bad back. Invitations to private dinners and weekend getaways simply stopped arriving. The wives of his friends and business partners, who had once tolerated Zara's presence with strained smiles, now greeted him with icy politeness before turning away. They sided unequivocally with Catherine. She had not asked them to. She didn't have to. Her actions had spoken for her, and they had all heard the message Catherine Ashworth was a woman to be respected. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. He tried to confront Catherine in their apartment that evening. The space once a monument to his success now felt like her sovereign territory. "What was that, Catherine?" he demanded, trying to summon his old booming authority. But his voice was hollow, a ghost in the vast living room. "What the hell was that whole spectacle?" Catherine looked up from a proposal she was reviewing for the foundation, her expression as placid as a deep lake. "That all," she said, her voice even and cool, "was me reminding you and everyone else who I am. I am not just your wife, Richard. I am the daughter of Robert Langley. I am a partner in this life we built. And I will not be dismissed or disrespected. Not by you, and certainly not by your mistress. You went behind my back. You allied with my rival, Michael Chen. He spat his face, turning blotchy. I built a board for my foundation. She corrected him gently, the correction itself a display of power. Michael Chen, despite your history, understands the importance of civic duty. Mrs. Tanaka is passionate about arts education. Their presence lends credibility to a cause I believe in. It was never about you, Richard. You simply assumed the world revolves around you. That has always been your problem. He stared at her, finally seeing the depth of his folly. He had poked a bear he thought was a kitten. He had mocked her clothes, her quietness, her dignity, failing to understand that those were the very sources of her strength. He had thought power was loud, flashy, and gold-sequined. He had been wrong. Power was a couture gown that whispered a strategic plan executed in silence and a network of allies bound by mutual respect, not by money. The final crushing blow came a week later. Richard was in his office staring at spreadsheets that suddenly seemed meaningless when his private line rang. It was David Merrill, the senior vice president from the bank financing the Tanaka project. Richard, David began, his tone uncomfortably formal. I'm calling about the final tranche of funding for the Ashworth Tower. The board had a meeting this morning. There are some concerns. Concerns, Richard repeated, his stomach clenching. The deal is signed. Tanaka is in. Yes, we know, but our commitment is contingent on our confidence in the project's leadership. Richard, the board is concerned about the stability of your personal leadership in light of the recent public developments. The press has been extensive. The implication was as clear as it was catastrophic. The bank and the world saw Catherine as the stable one. Without her implicitly by his side, Richard himself looked like a bad investment. He was facing financial ruin, not because of a market crash, but because he had failed to value his wife. He found her in the study, a place he now entered with the trepidation of a petitioner approaching a throne. The room was filled with the late afternoon sun, and she was bathed in it, an icon of calm authority. They're going to pull my funding, Catherine, he said, his voice stripped of all its usual bluster. He looked defeated, smaller a man, deflated. Because of you. Catherine put down her pen and folded her hands on the antique desk. No, Richard, she said, her voice not unkind, but firm as steel. It's because of you. It's because of your choices. Your arrogance, your profound lack of judgment, and your belief that the only person in this marriage who mattered was the one in the mirror. He sank into a chair opposite her, the leather sighing under his weight. What do you want, Ev? He whispered, using the old familiar diminutive. It sounded foreign, unearned. A divorce, half of everything. All of it. Catherine considered him for a long moment. She could ruin him completely. She had the power, the leverage, and the justification to do so. But she had never been motivated by pure revenge. Her goal had been reclamation, not destruction. I want respect, Richard, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. And I want a new arrangement. Our marriage as we knew it is over. That is non-negotiable. From now on, we are business partners. You will run your company, and I will run my foundation. We will maintain a public front of civility for the sake of our children and our remaining business interests. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Your affair with Zara Flynn will end, immediately and permanently. You will provide a generous but final settlement, the terms of which my lawyer will draft. It will include an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She will disappear from our lives and from the public eye. If I see so much as a single cryptic social media post from her, that settlement becomes void. Am I clear?" He could only nod his eyes wide. "We will live in this house as cohabitants, but not as a couple. We will attend major functions together when required as partners in the Ashworth-Langley enterprise, but our private lives will be entirely separate. These are my terms. They are not negotiable." Richard looked at the woman before him, poised, powerful, and in complete control, and he knew he had no choice. He had lost. He had been so busy looking down on his wife, so confident in her meekness, that he never saw her rise above him. He nodded slowly, the architect of a crumbling empire brought to his knees not by a market downturn or a corporate raider, but by the quiet, indomitable will of the woman whose dress he had let his mistress laugh at. Catherine Ashworth had not just won the battle. She had redrawn the entire map of their world, and in this new world, she was and would always be queen. Catherine's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about quiet confidence, strategic thinking, and knowing your own infinite worth. She transformed humiliation into empowerment and taught everyone who underestimated her a lesson they would never forget. What did you think of Catherine's epic comeback? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone so completely turned the tables on their detractors? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by this story of drama and triumph, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama. He was a man who had everything. A 9-figure net worth, a penthouse high above Central Park, and tonight, a 24-year-old beauty hanging on his arm. Jean-Pierre Moreau was celebrating. He'd chosen l'Orangerie, a restaurant so exclusive it felt like dining in a bank vault. But as he scanned the room, his world tilted. His ex-wife, Karen, the woman he had discarded, was at the best table. She was radiant, vibrant, and visibly pregnant. The man she was laughing with, his hand resting gently on her arm, was James Sterling. The one man in the city whose cultural power Jean couldn't buy. In that instant, the hunter became the prey. The chauffeured Maybach purred to a stop before the discreetly marked entrance of l'Orangerie. The doorman, a stoic figure who had guarded this portal to the elite for 2 decades, moved with practiced grace. Jean-Pierre Jean Moreau emerged first, a name synonymous with ruthless private equity. Jean was a man sculpted by ambition. His suit was a bespoke creation from a Savile Row tailor whose name was only whispered. At 52, he possessed a leonine confidence, his silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes projecting an aura of absolute control. He turned and extended a hand to his companion. Chloé Dubois, a woman whose beauty was as striking as it was meticulously maintained, took it. She was 24, a former art gallery assistant who now curated only one collection, herself, for Jean's viewing pleasure. Her dress, a shimmering sheath of emerald silk, clung to a figure honed by personal trainers and a diet of green juice and champagne. "Oh, Jean, it's divine," she breathed, her eyes wide as she took in the restaurant's opulent interior. L'Orangerie was less a public dining space and more a private club for the gods of finance and industry. Walls of dark, lustrous mahogany were adorned with original oil paintings. Each table was an island of intimacy, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the quiet murmur of power and the subtle scent of expensive perfume. "Only the best for you, my dear," Jean said, his hand possessively on the small of her back. He navigated the room with the assurance of a man who owned it. He nodded curtly at a banking magnate here, offered a tight smile to a shipping tycoon there. The maître d', a sleek Italian man named Lorenzo, approached with a deferential bow. "Mr. Moreau, a pleasure. Your usual table is ready." "Thank you, Lorenzo. And a bottle of the 96 Petrus to start." Jean didn't need to see a wine list. As they were led to a secluded corner booth upholstered in plush velvet, Chloe's hand tightened on his arm. "Everyone is looking at us," she whispered, a thrill in her voice. "Let them look," Jean replied, a smirk playing on his lips. He enjoyed the envy. It was a currency as valuable as the stocks in his portfolio. He was Jean Moreau, and this was his kingdom. Chloe, with her youth and flawless beauty, was merely the latest jewel in his crown, a testament to his enduring virility. He thought, with a fleeting and dismissive pang, of Karen, his wife of 22 years, the mother of his 2 now-grown children, Elizabeth and William. Karen, who had been there before the billions. She had been his partner. Her quiet intelligence and unwavering belief had been the crucial scaffold during his early, precarious climbs. But as his empire grew, so did his appetites. Karen, with her sensible shoes, her love of gardening at their Connecticut estate, and her gentle, unassuming nature, had started to feel inadequate. She was a comfortable armchair in a life that now demanded a throne. Their divorce had been a brutal, drawn-out affair. He had been generous, of course, in the way a king tosses a coin to a beggar. He'd given her the sprawling Connecticut estate, a beautiful prison he no longer wished to inhabit, and a settlement that ensured she'd never worry about money. But he had taken her dignity. His affair with Chloe, made public before the ink was dry, had been a deliberate act of cruelty, a message to the world, and to Karen herself, that she was no longer relevant. He had expected her to crumble. The sommelier arrived with the Petrus, presenting the bottle as if it were a holy relic. The ritual of the tasting, the swirl of the deep garnet liquid, brought Jean back to the present. He took a sip. It was perfect. "To us," he said, raising his glass to Chloe. "To us," she echoed, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. She was a perfect companion, beautiful and uncomplicated. She didn't challenge him. She didn't know the man he had been, only the monument he had become. He settled back, the wine warming his veins. He felt invincible. He was about to regale Chloe with the story of his latest corporate conquest when his gaze drifted across the room, and then he saw her. It was like a glitch in the Matrix. At the restaurant's most coveted table, the one nestled in a discreet alcove with a panoramic view, sat Karen. But it wasn't the Karen he remembered. The woman he saw was not the subdued, heartbroken figure he'd painted in his mind. This Karen was radiant. Her mousy brown hair was now a rich honey blonde, styled in soft waves. She was wearing a simple, elegant sapphire silk slip that shimmered under the lights, and it was draped over the unmistakable, pronounced swell of a heavily pregnant stomach. The shock was a physical blow, winding him. She laughed, a genuine, unrestrained peal of joy that stunned him. Her head was tilted back, her eyes sparkling. She looked vibrant, confident, and devastatingly beautiful. "Ricky, what is it?" Chloe's voice was an irritating buzz. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way," he murmured, his eyes locked on her table. But it wasn't just Karen's transformation that held him captive. It was the man she was with. James Sterling. The actor. Not a blockbuster action hero, but something more dangerous. A critically acclaimed, Yale-educated artist, the darling of the New York theater scene, and the heir to an old, intellectual New England fortune. Sterling was new power, cultural, not financial. He was the one man in the city John couldn't intimidate or buy. And this man was leaning in close to Karen, his expression one of rapt attention. He wasn't just dining with her. He was captivated. He reached across the table and briefly, gently, touched her hand. An easy, familiar intimacy. Then Sterling's gaze shifted to Karen's stomach, and he smiled. A smile of pure, unadulterated affection. A spear of jealousy, so potent it tasted like acid, shot through Jean's heart. The patras in his hand suddenly felt like lead. His meticulously constructed world, for the first time in a very long time, felt unstable. The vast, opulent space of l'orangerie suddenly felt claustrophobic. Jean couldn't tear his gaze away. Every laugh Karen shared with James Sterling, every shared glance, was a fresh torment. The pregnancy. It was a fact so enormous, so utterly incomprehensible that his mind struggled to process it. Who, how, when? He dissected their body language. The way James leaned in, the way Karen's hand rested on her own stomach, a gesture both protective and proud. It all pointed to a level of intimacy that sent a cold dread seeping into his bones. "Are you even listening to me?" Chloe's voice, sharp and edged with impatience, finally broke through his trance. He turned to her, his expression clouded. "What?" "I was telling you about the charity gala. I need a new gown, something spectacular." Her words were a meaningless drone. "Fine, get whatever you want," he said dismissively, his eyes already drifting back across the room, Chloe's perfectly sculpted brows furrowed. "Jin, what is wrong with you? You've been staring over there all night. It's rude." "I don't care what people think," he snapped. "You always care what people think," she retorted. "This is about her, isn't it? Your ex-wife." "It has nothing to do with her," he lied. He took a large swallow of the Petrus, but the bitter taste of jealousy remained. The evening devolved into a tense, silent ordeal. Jean picked at his food, a beautifully prepared Dover sole that might as well have been cardboard. He was trapped in a whirlwind of memory. He remembered the end. After 2 decades, he had told her, "Karen, I am no longer in love with you." A simple, brutal statement. He had expected tears. He had gotten stunned. Dignified silence. The divorce was a war of attrition. His lawyers on his explicit orders had been merciless. They'd painted her as out of touch, emotionally fragile. He'd wanted to win. He'd wanted to prove that leaving her was not just a choice, but an upgrade. And then, the night he'd gone back to the Connecticut estate to collect his things. The house was empty, echoing with 22 years of memories. He'd found her in the garden, her sanctuary. They hadn't argued. They had, for one night, been 2 people mourning the death of a shared life. It had been confusing, desperate, and deeply sad. They had fallen into bed, a final, messy collision of grief and familiarity. The next morning, he had left, the divorce papers waiting on the kitchen counter. He had boarded a plane to St. Bart's with Chloe. He had never looked back, until now. His eyes darted back to her table. He did the math, his mind a cold, racing calculator. The divorce was finalized 8 months ago. The last night was 9 months ago. Oh God, the room spun. The baby, it couldn't be. It was impossible. She would have told him. A woman like Karen with her morals, her sensible nature. She would never keep a secret like that. But the woman across the room wasn't the sensible Karen he remembered. This was a different woman. A woman dining with a celebrity, glowing with a confidence he'd never seen. A new, more insidious thought crept in. What if it was Sterling's? The timeline was tight, but possible. The thought of her moving on that quickly, of another man, an actor, touching her, starting a family with her, was a physical affront. He felt a growing, irrational anger. How dared she be happy? How dared she move on, not just to a new life, a better one? It was a betrayal of the narrative he had written. She was supposed to be the tragic figure, the one left behind. Her happiness felt like a personal insult, a judgment on his choices. As if sensing his turmoil, Lorenzo the maître materialized at his elbow. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Moreau?" "Everything is fine, Lorenzo," John said through gritted teeth. But then a thought, cold and calculating, slipped into his mind. "Lorenzo, who is that gentleman with Mrs. Moreau?" He used her old name deliberately, a petty assertion of his past claim. Lorenzo didn't bat an eye. "That is Mr. James Sterling, sir, the actor." "I know who he is," John said impatiently. "Are they regulars?" "Mr. Sterling dines occasionally. The lady, she has been in with him a few times over the past several months." Several months. This wasn't a first date. This was a relationship. The walls of his self-assurance began to crumble. The inevitable moment arrived. Karen and James Sterling had finished their meal. As Sterling settled the bill, discreetly with a black card, Jean noted with a strange pang of rivalry. Karen rose from her seat. Her movements were fluid, graceful even with the burden of her pregnancy. She smoothed down her sapphire dress and turned her gaze, for the first time that evening, across the room. Her eyes met Jean's. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a brief, unguarded moment of recognition. But it was quickly replaced by something else, a cool, unreadable composure. There was no pain, no anger, no lingering affection. There was nothing. It was the calm, polite neutrality one might afford a distant acquaintance. And that, more than any outburst or accusation, was what truly gutted him. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of cool acknowledgement, before turning her attention back to James, who was now standing beside her. James placed a light hand on her back, a gesture both protective and proprietary. He began to guide her towards the exit. Their path would take them directly past Jean's table. The air crackled. Jean's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a primal need to say something, to do something, to shatter that composure and force a reaction. Chloe, sensing the impending collision, sat bolt upright, her eyes wide, a spectator at a drama she was only just beginning to understand. As they drew level with the booth, James Sterling paused. He was taller than Jen remembered from films, with an air of quiet intensity. He turned his head and looked directly at John, his expression calm and steady. "Moreau," he said. His voice was even, devoid of any discernible emotion. Not Mr. Moreau, not Jean, just Moreau. It was a simple acknowledgement, yet it carried the weight of a gauntlet being thrown down. Jean, caught off guard, could only manage a curt nod in return. "Sterling." Karen's gaze followed. She looked at June. Then her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second to Chloe, taking in the crimson dress, the youthful face, the whole tableau of his new life. A ghost of a smile, enigmatic and faintly amused, touched her lips. "Jean," she said. Her voice was as smooth and cool as polished marble. It was the first time she had spoken his name in over a year. The sound of it from her lips was both foreign and painfully familiar. Then she turned and walked away, her head held high, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and shattered assumptions in her wake. James Sterling gave Jean one last long look, a look that was both a challenge and a dismissal, before following her. Jean sat frozen. The king was still in his castle, but his walls had been breached. He looked at Chloe, but saw only a pale imitation of the woman who had just walked out of his life for a second time. "Well," Chloe said, breaking the heavy silence, her voice dripping with a newfound sarcasm. "That was educational." Richard didn't answer. He was watching the door through which Karen and James had disappeared, a cold, terrifying thought solidifying in his mind. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. The shock was now hardening into something far more dangerous, a burning, obsessive need for retribution. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in frigid silence. The opulent interior of the Maybach, usually a cocoon of comfort, felt like a tomb. Chloe stared out the window at the glittering, indifferent city lights, while John replayed the scene at l'Orangerie over and over, each viewing adding a fresh layer of humiliation and rage. Karen's cool composure, Sterling's protective hand, the pregnancy. It was all a personal affront, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to mock him. He stormed into the penthouse, shrugging off his jacket and tossing it onto an expensive lounge chair. The apartment, a sprawling duplex with panoramic views of Central Park, was his sanctuary, a monument to his success. Tonight, it felt hollow. "I need a drink," he announced to no one, striding to the marble-topped bar. He ignored the vintage cognacs and reached for a bottle of vodka. He poured a generous measure into a crystal tumbler, forgoing ice, and downed it in one fiery gulp. Chloe watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed. The pouty, petulant woman from the restaurant had been replaced by someone with a harder, more calculating edge. "So, are you going to tell me what that was all about?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Or are you just going to drink yourself into a stupor?" "It was nothing," Jean grunted, pouring another. "A chance encounter." "It didn't look like nothing, Jean." She stepped further into the room. "The way you looked at her. I've never seen you look at me like that." The accusation hung in the air. "You look at me like I'm a prize. You looked at her like she was the one who got away." "Don't be ridiculous," he scoffed, but the words lacked conviction. "And him," she continued, "James Sterling. And she's pregnant. God, John, the look on your face. It's not about her. It's about your ego. It's about him. And it's about that baby." Her words were a slap in the face, a brutal, unwelcome truth. He whirled around, his eyes blazing. "You don't know what you're talking about. You know nothing about my life, about my marriage. I know what I see." Chloe's voice was now a furious shout. "I see a man who thought he had it all, who thought he could just discard a woman like an old suit, and is now having a full-blown meltdown because she dared to find happiness with someone else. Just someone else." The implication was clear. "Get out," John said, his voice low and dangerous. "What?" "I said, get out!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger towards the door. "Go back to your little apartment that I pay for, with the clothes I bought you, and leave me alone." Tears of rage and humiliation welled in Chloe's eyes. She stared at him, her beautiful face a mask of fury. "You know what, Jean? For the first time, I actually feel sorry for her. She escaped. I'm just living in the prison she broke out of." With that, she turned on her heel, snatched her purse from the counter, and stormed out, slamming the door with a resounding crash that seemed to shake the entire penthouse. Left alone, Jean sank onto a leather sofa, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. Chloe was right. His rage was fueled by a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, jealousy, and most terrifyingly, the dawning realization of that baby. His mind, conditioned to treat every problem as a business challenge, began to strategize. He needed information. He needed leverage. He needed to understand the dynamics of this new reality so he could find a way to disrupt it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It belonged to a man named Harrison Vance, a private investigator who operated in the grey areas of the law, a specialist in digging up the kind of dirt that could ruin reputations. "Vance," a gravelly voice answered. "It's Moreau." There was a slight pause. "Jean, it's been a long time. I trust you're not calling to reminisce. I need information, Harrison, on two people. My ex-wife, Karen Moreau, though she may be using her maiden name, Davis, and an actor named James Sterling." "Sterling? The actor?" Vance sounded intrigued. "Flying high these days. I want everything," John said, his voice a low growl. "Their relationship, how they met, how long, his financials, his business dealings, any vulnerabilities." He paused, the next words catching in his throat. "And her. I want to know about the baby. Whose is it? I want to know everything. I want to know where she goes, who she sees. I want to know her." He needed to understand the woman she had become. He needed to find the chink in her new armor. "That's a deep dive, John. It'll be expensive." "I don't care about the cost," Jean said, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "I want it done, and I want it quiet. Quiet is my middle name." After hanging up, Jean felt a sliver of his old control returning. He was taking action. But a new, unsettling thought began to form. Why was Sterling with Karen? A man like him could have any woman. Why choose a divorced, pregnant woman in her late 40s? The thought was both repulsive and strangely comforting. If Karen was a pawn in a larger game, it would make sense. But then another, more insidious thought crept in. What if, in his blind arrogance, he had thrown away a diamond, only to see it picked up and polished by a more discerning eye? The investigation wasn't just about information anymore. It was about finding a way to stitch his world back together, even if it meant tearing theirs apart. The week that followed was a private hell. Jean moved through his life like an automaton. He executed a flawless, ruthless hostile takeover of a mid-level tech firm, his performance in the boardroom as cold and precise as ever. But it felt hollow. The thrill was gone. He had broken things off with Chloe via a text to his assistant, instructing him to handle the transition. The apartment, the car, the allowance, all would be terminated. It was a simple, clean amputation, the way he'd always operated. But he found no peace. He sat alone in the cavernous penthouse, the silence amplifying the questions roaring in his head. He found himself dialing his children's numbers, then hanging up. What would he say? He called his son, William, a 25-year-old analyst trying to make his own way. "Dad?" William's voice was wary. They hadn't spoken in weeks. "William, just calling to check in." "I'm fine, Dad. Busy. I saw your mother at l'Orangerie." A cold silence on the other end. "Oh," William finally said. "Yeah. She's been out more. She's with that actor, Sterling, James. Yeah, he's a good guy, Dad. He makes her happy." "Happy," John repeated, the word tasting like ash. "And the situation?" "She's pregnant, William. Why didn't anyone tell me?" The silence that followed was heavier, colder. "Dad," William said, his voice dropping. "That's really not my place to discuss. It's complicated. You should talk to her." "Is it his?" Jean pushed, the question tearing out of him. "I have to go, Dad," William said abruptly. "I have a meeting." He hung up. Jean stared at the phone. "He's a good guy, Dad." The simple, devastating endorsement. His own son, siding with the enemy. He found himself wandering into the wing of the penthouse Karen had decorated. He hadn't been in here since she left. Her study. It was still filled with her books, her scent faintly lingering in the air. He had been so eager to erase her, Yet he had left this room untouched, a museum to a life he'd torpedoed. He poured another vodka, the ice clinking in the silence. He was a man who hated variables. He hated unknowns. And Karen, James, and this baby were a blinding, terrifying unknown. His anger was a shield, protecting him from the more vulnerable emotion lurking beneath. Fear. Fear that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Fear that he wasn't just losing a game, but that he'd already lost, and this was just the victory lap for the other side. He remembered her at 30, her face bright with intelligence as she edited his business plans, her quiet confidence the bedrock he'd built his empire on. He remembered her at 40, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes as she managed his volatile ego, their children's needs, and the demands of their public life. And he remembered his own casual, brutal dismissal of her worth. "You don't understand, Karen. This is a different league now. You're not built for it." He had seen her practicality as a weakness, her integrity as a lack of imagination. Now, that same woman was radiating a power he couldn't comprehend on the arm of a man who represented everything he wasn't: cultured, respected, admired. He needed Vance's report. He needed a weapon. He needed to find the lie in her new, perfect life. Because if it was all true, if she was genuinely happy, if she was pregnant, if she had moved on, then what did that make him? He was no longer the victor. He was just the man who'd been left behind. The thought was so intolerable, he threw his crystal tumbler against the wall, the sound of shattering glass echoing the state of his own fractured certainty. He was a king in an empty castle, and the ghost he thought he'd banished was now laying siege. A week after the call, a plain manila envelope arrived at John's private office. Inside was a slim USB drive and a single typed message: Installment 1, HV. John dismissed his secretary, locked his office door, and slid the drive into his laptop. The screen populated with files, surveillance photos, financial reports, and a detailed summary. His heart pounded. He clicked on the summary for Corin first. The report confirmed she hadn't crumbled. She had sold the Connecticut estate within a month of the divorce, a move that stunned June. He'd seen it as her gilded cage, her consolation prize. She had clearly viewed it as a link to a past she wanted to sever. She had moved into a, still very expensive, brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, but the money trail was not what he expected. She hadn't gone on shopping sprees. Instead, Vance's report detailed the creation of a small, anonymous foundation called the Second Act Fund, dedicated to providing grants and mentorship for women over 40 re-entering the workforce. The photos were not of a lonely woman. They showed Karen in boardrooms, at a university podium, and laughing in a sunlit coffee shop with other women. She looked poised, engaged, and purposeful. The radiant woman at l'Orangerie was not an anomaly. It was her new reality. Then, the connection to James Sterling. They hadn't met at a gala. They'd met at a fundraiser for the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Sterling was a major patron. Karen had been invited by a board member who was an early supporter of her foundation. According to Vance's sources, Sterling had been immediately captivated by her passion and intelligence. Their first date had been a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. Vance's report stated, "The relationship appears to be genuine, built on mutual respect and shared interests. Sterling is a frequent visitor to her brownstone. They are, by all accounts, a committed couple." Jean's stomach soured. This wasn't a sordid affair or a power play. It was a partnership. He clicked on the file for James Sterling. The financials were, as expected, significant but old. His wealth was in trusts and legacy holdings, not in the liquid, aggressive assets Jean controlled. Sterling wasn't a shark. He was a blue whale, moving in different waters. But Vance had dug deeper, and there, He found something. Sterling was in the final stages of pre-production for his directorial debut, a film he had also written. It was a passion project, years in the making. The title, The Golden Leash. The film was a scathing critique of a charismatic, sociopathic Wall Street financier who destroys lives for sport, all while maintaining a perfect public image. Vance had, through contacts, managed to acquire a summary of the script. Jean read it, his blood turning to ice. The villain wasn't just like him. It was him. The way he talked, the deals he made, a specific reference to a hostile takeover Jean had orchestrated in 2018. Even the villain's habit of smoking a rare, specific brand of cigar that Jean favored. It was unmistakable. This was a coordinated, public execution. Sterling was using Karen's pain, her stories, to build his masterpiece. Then, Jean clicked the final file, the one marked KM Medical. It was brief, clinical, and devastating. Vance had accessed her medical records. Patient, Karen Moreau Davis, DOB. Physician, Dr. Elena Ruiz, Park Slope, Women's Health. Service, 12-week prenatal ultrasound. S10, due date. Jean stared at the date. His mind flashed back to the Connecticut estate, the scent of rain and old memories, the whiskey they'd shared, the desperate, foolish, final act. He did the calculation, once, twice. There was no doubt, no ambiguity. The baby was his. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him. Rage, white-hot and blinding. Betrayal, sharp and cold. And something else, a terrifying, possessive ownership. She had known. For months, Karen had known she was carrying his child, his heir, and she had said nothing. She had, instead, paraded her pregnancy in front of him in a restaurant, on the arm of another man. A man who was simultaneously preparing to crucify him in public. The narrative in his head snapped into focus. This wasn't a romance. This was a conspiracy. Karen and her new lover were playing a long, dark game. They were using his child, his legacy, as a weapon against him. The hunter was no longer the prey. The hunter was at war. Jean's paralysis evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical fury. He was no longer the humiliated observer. He was back in his element, the battlefield. He saw the entire conspiracy laid bare. Karen, the wounded wife, feeding stories to her new lover. Sterling, the artist, using that pain to build his reputation, to launch his new career as a director. And the baby? The baby was the ultimate leverage, the biological trump card they hadn't played yet. "They want a war," he said to the empty office. "They'll get a war." His mind, conditioned for decades to treat every problem as a hostile takeover, began to strategize. He couldn't attack Karen directly. The optics of going after a pregnant woman, his ex-wife, were terrible. And she was, he grudgingly admitted, insulated by her foundation and her newfound purpose. But Sterling was a different story. An actor, a director, was only as powerful as his last project. And The Golden Leash was a project built on a foundation of lies, funded by other people's money. Jean picked up his phone. His first call was not to a lawyer, but to David Chen, his head of corporate strategy, a man with a mind as ruthless as his own. "David," Jean said, his voice hard as steel. "I have a new project for you. Off the books. I need you to find out who is financing an independent film titled The Golden Leash. Director, James Sterling." "An actor, sir?" David sounded confused. "He's a problem I need to solve," John said. "I want a full breakdown of the investors. Private equity, hedge funds, Hollywood studios, individuals. I want to know who they are. And more importantly, what leverage we have over them. Leverage, sir? Find a connection, David. Do they have loans with us? Are we in a competitive space with them? Do they have a project they need funded? Find me a vulnerability. I want to squeeze them until they drop this film. His next call was to his top corporate lawyer. I need you to look at my divorce settlement, specifically the non-disclosure and non-disparagement clauses. My ex-wife is in violation. She is actively participating in a public smear campaign. His third call was to Harrison Vance. Vance, the report was illuminating. I need you to keep digging on Sterling. I don't want his financials. I want his dirt. Ex-girlfriends, professional rivalries, any skeletons. I want ammunition. Within 48 hours, Gene had his answer. The primary financier for the Golden Leash was Apex Capital, a boutique investment firm in Los Angeles that was trying to build a new media division. Gene knew the CEO, a man named Mark Sullivan. In fact, Sullivan's firm was a junior creditor in a real estate deal John was currently restructuring. Sullivan was exposed. Jean dialed him directly. Mark, Jean Moreau, how's the family? Jean, good to hear from you. Family's great. What can I do for you? I hear you're in the movie business now, Mark. An interesting little picture called The Golden Leash. The silence on the other end was deafening. It's a small passion project we're backing, Sullivan finally said, his voice wary. It's a problem, Mark. A problem for me. It's a libelous, targeted attack on my character, and by extension, my business, and your firm is bankrolling it. Jean, I had no idea. The script was presented as a general satire. Save it, Jean snapped. Here's what's going to happen. You are going to pull your funding. You're going to cite creative differences or budgetary overruns. I don't care. You will kill this film. Gene, I can't just... We have contracts. Sterling will sue. He can't sue if his film has no money. And you're not going to be able to fight him because your capital is going to be tied up. Remember that hotel deal in Miami? I'm calling in my senior debt position. I can have your entire portfolio there, frozen by Monday, pending a review. Or the Golden Leash can just go away. It was a blatant, brutal power play. Sullivan, trapped, knew it. I'll make some calls, Sullivan stammered. You do that, Gene said and hung up. He leaned back, a grim smile on his face. He had cut off the snake's head. Sterling's passion project was dead. His reputation would be in tatters when he failed to deliver. And Karen, her new, powerful, artistic boyfriend, would be revealed as a fraud, a failure. The plan was audacious, ruthless, and deeply satisfying. It restored his sense of control. He was no longer the passive, humiliated observer. He was Jean Moreau, the puppet master, and he was about to start pulling the strings. He was ready to make his final move. He was going to see Karen. He didn't call. He didn't have his assistant schedule a meeting. He drove himself, not in the Maybach, but in a black Range Rover. He found her in the small, beautifully curated garden behind her Brooklyn brownstone. She was kneeling on a mat, weeding a bed of hydrangeas. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes widened, first in surprise, then they hardened into a cool, steady gaze. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. June, what are you doing here? She didn't stand up, forcing him to loom over her, a position that suddenly felt awkward, not powerful. We need to talk, he said. We're divorced. We have nothing to talk about. She went back to her weeding. The casual dismissal stoked his anger. Don't play dumb, Karen. I know about the baby. Her hand stilled. She slowly, carefully, pushed herself to her feet, one hand on her back, the other on her pregnant belly. She faced him, her expression unreadable. And? He repeated, incredulous. And? It's my baby, Karen, my child, my heir. And you were just, what, going to hide him from me? His name, she said, her voice dangerously quiet, is not him or it, and he's not an heir. He's a baby, and he is my baby. Our baby, Jean roared. Conceived in my house. You lied to me, Karen. You've been lying for months. A lie of omission, Jean? Is that what this is? Let's talk about lies. She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw she wasn't just glowing. She was formidable. You lied to me for 3 years with a string of assistants. You lied to our children. You lied about your assets in the divorce. You built an empire of lies. And you're mad because I wanted one thing, just one thing, for myself, free of your control, your contamination. He was stunned. This was not the Karen he knew. Contamination? I gave you everything. You gave me a prison, she shot back. A beautiful, gilded prison. And when I found out I was pregnant, after that night, she shuddered. I was terrified. Not because I was pregnant, but because I knew. I knew you would see him as a thing, an asset, a piece of your legacy. You wouldn't see a child. And I was right. And what about him? Jean sneered, changing tactics. Your new boy toy, the actor. Is this his idea? Was this the plan? You get pregnant with my baby, and he writes a movie to crucify me. A public shakedown? He had expected the accusation to shatter her. He expected tears, denials. Instead, Karen laughed, a short, bitter laugh. A plan? My God, Jean, you really are that arrogant. You think the world revolves around you. She stepped past him, towards the house. You want to know the plan? I met James 2 months after I found out I was pregnant. I was alone, and I was terrified. He was kind. He listened. He treated me like a person, not an object. He's not using me, Jean. He's protecting me. From you. And the movie? Jean pressed, following her. Don't lie to me. He's using my life. He's using you. Karen turned at the doorway. Her eyes were clear and cold as ice. He was writing The Golden Leash for 2 years before he ever met me, Jean. It's about his own father, another king who destroyed his family. The blood drained from Jean's face. It's true, she continued. When I told him my story, he saw the parallels. But he's not attacking you because of me. He was drawn to me because I had survived the very monster he'd been trying to expose his whole life. You're not his target, Jean. You're just a cliché. You're the poster child for a whole generation of broken, empty men. And the golden leash? It was never about you. It was the ultimate reversal. Not a conspiracy. Just a coincidence. He wasn't the villain of Sterling's story. He was just a footnote. I stopped him, John stammered, needing to regain control. The money. I had it pulled. Apex Capital. The film is dead. He waited for her to crumble. Karen just looked at him with a deep, profound pity. You did that? Of course you did. You destroy everything you touch. It's over, Karen. No, John, she said, placing her hand on her stomach. It's just beginning. You see, James anticipated you'd do something like this. He's not stupid. He's not like you. A car door slammed outside. James Sterling walked into the garden, his expression calm. Karen, is everything okay? He saw Jean, and his eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with a cold dislike. Everything's fine, Jamie, Karen said, walking to him. Jean was just leaving. I pulled your funding, Jean snarled at Sterling. Your movie is finished. James looked at him, then at Karen, and then he smiled. You're talking about the Apex money. Oh, that. That was just our first round. After your little stunt at l'Orangerie, we had a feeling you'd try something small. So we made some calls of our own. What are you talking about? The story of you trying to bully Mark Sullivan leaked, Jean, James said. You're all over Variety and the Hollywood Reporter this morning. Financier tries to kill film that allegedly exposes him. Turns out, trying to silence a film is the best PR it can get. We've been flooded. We're now fully funded, independently. Thanks to you. Jean stared, his world unraveling. He hadn't cut off the snake's head. He'd just made it a hydra. Get off her property, Moreau, James said, his voice no longer that of a calm artist, but of a man defending his home. Jean looked at Karen, her face serene, standing beside her new protector. He looked at the swell of his child, a child he would never know, a legacy he could never claim. He had lost. June didn't just leave the brownstone. He retreated. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of impotent rage and crushing, hollow defeat. He arrived at his office to find his world on fire. The Golden Leash was the top story on every entertainment and financial news site. His heavy-handed call to Mark Sullivan, once a secret power play, was now a public relations disaster. The narrative was set. Jean Moreau, the billionaire bully, was trying to silence artists. His partners were spooked. His board was furious. Obsessive and erratic were the words being whispered. The scandal wasn't about money. It was about judgment. His judgment. Then, the second blow. Chloe, whom he had discarded so clinically, had apparently given an anonymous but devastatingly detailed interview to Vanity Fair. She spoke of his terrifying obsession with his ex-wife, his unhinged rage, and his cold, controlling nature. The prison she'd escaped from was now on public display. Jean Moreau was toxic. The final blow came not from the press, but from a quiet, sober-looking man who arrived at his penthouse. A process server. He was being sued. Karen was not just reopening the divorce settlement. She was suing for full and sole custody of their unborn child, citing Jean's patterns of harassment, intimidation, and emotional instability. She was using his own actions, the PI, the threats to Sterling, the confrontation at her home, as evidence that he was a danger to her and the baby. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for peace. And in doing so, she was taking away the one thing he thought he could control: his legacy. The film, The Golden Leash, premiered 6 months later to universal acclaim. Critics praised its raw, unflinching portrait of financial sociopathy and James Sterling's masterful, nuanced direction. It was a box office hit. Jean Moreau became, as Karen had predicted, a cliché, a punchline. Jean sat in his penthouse, the city lights glittering below. The apartment was pristine, silent, and empty. His son and daughter rarely called. His business partners treated him with a new, wary distance. His empire of glass and steel was still there, but he was a pariah within it. He thought of the baby, a son. He'd seen the announcement. William James Davis. She had given the child her own maiden name, severing the final link. He hadn't just lost a war. He had been erased. Across the river, in a warm brownstone, Karen held her son. The house was filled with the scent of milk and new beginnings. James was at the table, reading a new script. This one wasn't his. It was Karen's. It was a pilot for a show about a woman in her late 40s, rebuilding her life. A story about second chances, about finding your voice, about discovering that your greatest strength isn't in the man you married, but in the woman you've always been. It's good, James said, looking up, his eyes shining. It's really good. Karen smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. She looked at her son, at the man she loved, at the city skyline across the water. She had faced her ghost, and she had won. It wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of redemption. Her redemption, in the end. Power wasn't about 9-figure bank accounts or penthouse views. It wasn't about control or a legacy built on fear. True power was the quiet resilience of a woman who, after being discarded, chose to rebuild. It was the courage to find a new love, to protect a new life, and to tell her own story. Jean Moreau still had his kingdom, but he was a king with no subjects, a man haunted by the life he'd thrown away. Karen, having lost everything, had finally gained it all: her voice, her dignity, and her freedom. A truly satisfying second act. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If you were moved by Karen's journey of resilience and justice, please show your support. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are possible, and subscribe for more stories of empowerment and redemption.